Hello, and welcome back to the Sleepy Geographer. Tonight, we're taking a gentle journey to the Dead Sea, exploring the strange waters, ancient salt, and changing landscape of one of Earth's most remarkable places. And beneath this quiet surface, a hidden transformation is already taking place. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy seeing people from around the world joining these peaceful journeys. Now, get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. Picture yourself standing at the edge of this sea, the ground beneath your feet, a mixture of pale, hardened mud and fine white crystal, crunching softly with each step you take toward the water. The air here holds a stillness unlike almost anywhere else on the surface of this planet. Warm and dry and strangely heavy, settling around you the way a blanket settles once it's finally been pulled close. In front of you, the water stretches out toward distant cliffs rising on the far shore, their pale stone catching the last warm light of the afternoon and holding it in long, soft streaks of gold and rose. The surface of the sea itself is almost perfectly calm, barely disturbed by any wind. Its colour, a deep, saturated blue that seems, in this particular light, to hold something closer to weight than colour, as though the water itself were denser, somehow, than water anywhere else you've ever seen. Behind you, the land rises steeply, dry hills and sheer rock faces climbing toward a sky that, even this late in the day, holds an unusual clarity. Thin and pale, the kind of sky found only in places sitting far below the ordinary elevation most landscapes occupy. There is a sense here, standing at this particular shore, of having descended into something, of being held within a bowl carved deep into the surface of the earth, walled in on every side by rising stone. The light here behaves in its own particular way too, worth noticing before we continue any further. Because this basin sits so far below the surrounding highlands, sunlight arrives having already passed through a thicker stretch of atmosphere than it would at almost any other exposed elevation, filtered and softened in a manner that gives even the harshest midday hours a faint, hazy quality and turns the late afternoon into something closer to a slow, extended glow, the cliffs holding their colour, for what feels like considerably longer than an ordinary sunset elsewhere might allow. The air itself carries a particular kind of quiet, one worth noticing carefully before we go any further into tonight's story. Very little moves here. No waves break against the shore the way they might along an ordinary coastline. No birds call from anywhere close by, since so little can survive in the water itself, and even the wind, when it does move, arrives softened, muted, as though the sheer weight of the water and the stillness of the whole surrounding basin had somehow settled into the air as well. This stillness isn't simply a passing mood, the kind of temporary calm that might settle over any body of water on a particularly quiet evening. It's something closer to a permanent condition here, shaped directly by the particular depth of this valley, the particular density of this water, the particular isolation of this entire basin from nearly everything moving and changing across the wider landscape surrounding it. Kneel down for a moment at the water's edge, close enough to see where the sea meets the dry, cracked earth beyond it. Along this boundary, something delicate and precise is happening, has been happening for longer than anyone standing here tonight could properly measure. Where the water's edge has receded, even slightly, where the water's edge has slowly receded, a thin residue remains behind on the drying ground, catching the light in small, scattered points of white. The ground itself, moving away from the water's immediate edge, tells its own quiet story in texture alone. Closest to the sea, the mud remains soft and dark, still holding whatever moisture the water left behind on its last, gentle retreat. A little further back, that same mud has dried into a pale, cracked crust, broken into small, irregular tiles the way drying earth tends to fracture anywhere on this planet. And further back still, past even that cracked, hardened ground, a fine dusting of white begins to appear, salt left behind by water that receded from this particular spot long enough ago that nothing remains now except its mineral residue, pale and dry, resting on ground the sea has already, in its own slow way, abandoned. Look closer still, and you'll find, resting right at this boundary between wet and dry, a single crystal of salt, small enough to rest easily on a fingertip, its structure precise and geometric in a way that seems almost too deliberate to have formed on its own. This is where our story tonight will keep returning, again and again, to this single, patient crystal, and to the process that built it, one that has been unfolding along this shoreline for longer than any nearby city, any nearby road, any nearby human settlement has existed in its current form. This crystal did not simply appear. It formed slowly, as water carrying dissolved minerals reached this exact spot, warmed under the relentless desert sun, and released its moisture back into the dry air above it, leaving behind everything it had been carrying, mineral by mineral, until finally, here, at this precise boundary between water and land, something solid took shape from something that had only recently been entirely dissolved and invisible within the sea itself. Turn this small crystal gently in the fading light, and its structure reveals itself with a precision that seems almost too ordered for something formed by nothing more than sun and stillness. Its faces meet at sharp, consistent angles, each one a small, faceted mirror catching whatever light happens to fall across it. This particular geometry isn't accidental. It reflects the fundamental structure of the mineral itself, atoms arranging themselves according to the same basic pattern every time, whether this crystal formed here, tonight, or somewhere else along this same shoreline centuries before either of us existed to notice it. We'll follow this same process across the whole of tonight's journey, watching how it has shaped not just this single crystal, but an entire landscape, an entire chemistry, an entire slow, ongoing transformation happening to one of the strangest bodies of water anywhere on the surface of this planet. Because tonight, we're going to ask a question worth sitting with for a while before we even begin looking for any kind of answer. Why is this ancient sea disappearing? Not disappearing suddenly or violently or in any way that would announce itself with drama or urgency. This sea is disappearing slowly, patiently, the way nearly everything explored across our evenings together tends to unfold, 1 metre of shoreline at a time, 1 evaporated drop at a time, 1 settled crystal of salt at a time, across a stretch of years considerably longer than most people watching it happen have been alive to notice. This is a sea that has existed, in one form or another, for a very long time, fed for thousands of years by the same river system flowing down from distant highlands, held within the same deep basin carved by forces working far below the surface of this land. And yet, within the span of only a handful of decades, this same sea has begun retreating from its own shoreline more visibly and more rapidly than at almost any other point in its long, patient history. Understanding why requires us to explore nearly everything about this place: its location, its extreme depth, the particular chemistry of its water, the fragile balance between what flows in and what evaporates out, and the modern human activity that has begun tipping that ancient balance in ways this sea has never quite experienced before. But that understanding can wait a little longer. For now, it's enough simply to stand here at this quiet shore and notice the crystal resting at your feet, small and precise and patient, the first small piece of a much larger story we're about to follow together tonight. Let's begin, then, with the most basic question of all. Where, exactly, does this strange, still sea actually sit on the surface of the planet? The Dead Sea rests within a long, narrow depression called the Jordan Rift Valley, a stretch of land forming part of a much larger geological feature extending far beyond this one particular sea, running north through the valley, carrying the Jordan River itself, and continuing south, eventually connecting to an even more extensive system of rift valleys stretching deep into the African continent. This rift represents a place where the Earth's crust has been slowly pulling apart, two great tectonic plates slowly sliding past one another across millions of years, while the land between them has gradually sunk, the same basic kind of process explored in other stories on this channel, though producing here a considerably different result than the rising mountains built by colliding plates elsewhere. On the planet's surface, where two plates push together, the ground rises, folding upward into ridges and peaks. Where two plates pull apart, as they have been doing here for a very long stretch of geological time, the ground instead sinks, opening a long, narrow trench between the separating edges. This particular stretch of rift belongs to a much larger fracture in the Earth's crust, one that continues mile after mile, well beyond the boundaries of this single sea, connecting eventually far to the south, with rift systems shaping some of the most dramatic landscapes found anywhere on the African continent. Standing here at this quiet shore, it can be easy to forget that the ground beneath your feet is part of something considerably larger. One small stretch of a fracture line running for thousands of kilometers across two entire continents, still slowly widening, still slowly sinking, at a pace far too gradual for any single human lifetime to properly register. This particular stretch of Rift Valley forms a natural boundary between several modern political territories, the sea itself bordered on its western shore by Israel and the West Bank, and on its eastern shore by Jordan, the water resting quietly between them, indifferent in the way that ancient geology tends to be indifferent to whatever boundaries and borders human history has drawn across the surrounding landscape in recent centuries. The sea's actual shape has narrowed and shifted considerably in recent decades, something we'll return to in much greater detail a little later in tonight's journey. But even in its current, reduced form, it remains an unmistakable presence within this valley, a long, roughly oval body of water stretching for a considerable distance from north to south, narrower from east to west, held within steep walls of rising desert cliff on nearly every side. Picture this entire basin from somewhere high above it, the way you might picture the whole shape of a landscape from an aircraft window. The sea itself sits as a deep blue presence at the very bottom of a long, dramatic trench, walled in by pale, dry mountains rising steeply on both sides. The whole scene surrounded by desert stretching outward in every direction beyond those enclosing cliffs, a landscape holding almost none of the greenery or moisture typically associated with a body of water this size. The desert surrounding this sea deserves its own attention here because it shapes nearly everything about the character of this particular landscape. Rainfall across this entire region remains remarkably scarce, some of the driest conditions found anywhere in this part of the world, the surrounding hills and cliffs holding little vegetation beyond whatever hardy, drought-adapted plants have managed to establish themselves in the thin, rocky soil clinging to these steep slopes. This scarcity of rainfall matters enormously to the story we're following tonight, because it means the sea receives very little direct replenishment from the sky above it, relying instead almost entirely on whatever water manages to reach it from elsewhere, carried down through rivers and streams originating in distant, wetter highlands considerably further from this particular basin. The cliffs themselves, rising steeply along much of the shoreline, hold their own particular beauty, layered bands of pale stone recording in their own patient way. The geological history of this entire rift valley, formed across a length of time reaching back millions of years, long before this particular sea, in anything resembling its current form, ever began collecting water at the base of this deep, dramatic trench. At certain times of day, particularly in the hour before sunset, these layered cliffs catch the light in a manner that reveals their history with unusual clarity. Each band of stone a slightly different shade, pale gold giving way to soft rose, then to a deeper, muted brown, each layer a separate chapter of sediment laid down across a stretch of geological time long before this rift ever began its own slow, patient widening. The scale of this entire basin is worth pausing over for a moment because it helps explain why the changes we're going to follow across tonight's journey, dramatic as they are, still unfold at a pace measured in years and decades rather than anything sudden or immediate. This is not a small pond, easily emptied or refilled within a single season. It's a genuine sea, holding, even in its currently reduced state, an enormous volume of water, resting within a basin large enough that even significant annual changes in its water level translate into shifts occurring gradually, steadily, across a stretch of time long enough that anyone visiting this shore across successive years would need to look carefully to notice just how much has actually changed since their last visit. And yet, change it has, considerably, across the span of only a few generations, in a way that stands out clearly against the much longer, much slower rhythm of the deep geological history shaping the rift valley surrounding it. This is part of what makes this particular sea's story so worth exploring closely tonight. The way it holds within it both the almost unimaginably patient timescale of tectonic movement and continental drift, and the considerably more immediate, more rapid timescale of modern human activity, both operating simultaneously on the very same stretch of water and shoreline. Before we move any further into that story, though, it's worth simply resting here a while longer, at this quiet shore, taking in the particular scale and stillness of this remarkable place. The water stretches out before you, dark and heavy and calm. The cliffs rise behind you, pale and ancient and patient. And somewhere between the two, along this narrow strip of drying earth where wet ground gives way gradually to dry, our small crystal of salt continues resting exactly where it formed, a tiny, precise fragment of a much larger, much slower story still unfolding all around it. There is one more thing worth understanding about this particular location before we continue any further, and it concerns not simply where this sea sits, but how far down it actually rests within the surface of this planet. This basin doesn't simply sit at a modest elevation below its surrounding highlands, the way many valleys and lowlands do elsewhere on Earth's surface. It sits considerably lower than that, lower, in fact, than almost anywhere else exposed to open air anywhere on this entire planet. The water's surface here rests more than 400 meters below what's typically considered ordinary sea level, the same baseline elevation used to measure height and depth everywhere else across the surface of the Earth. Picture what this actually means for a moment, because the phrase itself, below sea level, can slide past without properly registering its full strangeness. Ordinary sea level marks the surface of the world's connected oceans, the baseline against which every mountain's height and every valley's depth is typically measured. To stand at the shore of this sea is to stand considerably lower than that baseline, lower than the surface of the ocean itself would sit if it somehow extended this far inland, held instead within a deep, enclosed basin that has never once connected to any ocean across the whole of its own particular geological history. This extreme depth changes the character of everything within this basin. The air pressing down with a density greater than anywhere else on the exposed surface of this planet. The atmosphere here thicker, heavier, carrying more oxygen within each breath than the same volume of air would hold at any ordinary elevation closer to conventional sea level. We'll spend more time exploring exactly what this particular depth means for anyone standing within this basin a little further along in tonight's journey. For now, it's enough simply to notice the strangeness of the fact itself, this sea resting at the very bottom of the deepest exposed depression on the entire surface of the Earth, walled in by cliffs rising steeply on every side, holding within its basin an atmosphere and a stillness found nowhere else quite like it anywhere on this planet. Our small crystal of salt continues resting exactly where we left it, at the edge of this remarkable, deep, still water, patient and precise. The first small piece of an entire chemistry we'll explore in considerably greater depth as this journey continues. Let the whole shape of this place settle now, before we continue any further into tonight's story. A long, narrow rift, torn slowly open across millions of years by two tectonic plates drifting apart. A sea resting at the very bottom of that rift, deeper below ordinary sea level than almost anywhere else exposed to open sky on this entire planet. Cliffs rising steeply on every side, pale and ancient, holding within their layered stone a record of geological time reaching back far beyond anything this particular sea has witnessed in its own considerably shorter history. And at the water's edge, where wet ground meets dry, a single crystal of salt, small and precise, resting quietly, waiting for whatever comes next in the long, patient story of a sea that has been slowly, steadily, shrinking away from its own ancient shoreline. Somewhere north of this basin, high in a range of mountains considerably wetter and considerably greener than the desert surrounding this sea, rain falls onto slopes that eventually feed a river flowing steadily southward, carrying water across a considerable distance before finally reaching the shore where our crystal continues resting, patient and small at the edge of the retreating water. This is the Jordan River, and it represents, by a wide margin, the single largest source of fresh water this sea has ever received across the whole of its long history. And once we follow that water all the way south, we begin to understand something important about this quiet sea and why its shoreline has slowly been moving away from us. Why a sea fed for thousands of years by the same steady source has begun, within only the past several decades, shrinking away from its own ancient shoreline. The Jordan River begins its own journey considerably further north, gathered from several smaller headwater streams rising in highlands where snow and rainfall remain considerably more abundant than anywhere within the deep, dry basin this water is eventually headed toward. From there, the river flows south, passing through a series of valleys and lowlands, gathering additional water from smaller tributaries along the way, before finally descending into the Rift Valley itself and continuing onward toward the sea, waiting at the very bottom of this long, dramatic trench. This journey, considered purely in terms of geography, isn't especially long by the standards of many other major rivers explored across previous evenings on this channel. But the elevation change involved is considerable. The river descending steadily from its highland source all the way down to a basin sitting hundreds of meters below ordinary sea level, arriving finally at water resting lower than almost any other river's final destination found anywhere else on the surface of this planet. Along the way, this river winds through a landscape that shifts considerably as elevation drops, beginning in cooler, greener country before gradually entering warmer, drier terrain, the surrounding vegetation thinning with every passing kilometre, until finally, By the time the river approaches this deep basin, the land on either bank has become almost entirely desert, dry hills and pale stone stretching. Outward, in every direction beyond the narrow, green ribbon the river itself carves through the otherwise parched surrounding countryside. Beyond the Jordan itself, smaller streams and springs contribute their own modest share to this sea's water supply. Seasonal flows emerging briefly after rare desert rainfall and a scattering of natural springs releasing groundwater steadily along certain stretches of the surrounding shoreline. None of these smaller sources rival the Jordan's own considerable contribution, but together, across the full span of a typical year, they add their own small, patient volume to the total water this basin receives. Some of these springs emerge from deep within the surrounding cliffs themselves, water that has travelled slowly through underground channels for a considerable stretch of time before finally reaching daylight again, cool and mineral-rich, trickling down toward the shore in thin, quiet threads easily overlooked amid the much larger, much more visible presence of the Jordan's own steady flow. What makes this particular sea so unusual, though, isn't simply where its water comes from, but what happens to that water once it finally arrives. Nearly every other major body of water explored across our evenings together eventually finds some outlet, some river or channel carrying its accumulated water onward toward an ocean, continuing the endless cycle of gathering and releasing that shapes nearly every other lake and sea found across the surface of this planet. This sea has no such outlet. Nothing flows out of it toward any ocean, toward any other river, toward any other body of water anywhere else on the surface of this planet. Water arrives here, carried down from distant highlands by the Jordan River and its smaller companions, and then, having arrived, it simply stays, held within this deep, enclosed basin with nowhere else to go. Geographers and hydrologists have a particular term for a body of water shaped this way, describing it as endorheic or terminal, meaning simply that whatever water flows into it has no further path onward, no outlet leading eventually to any ocean, the basin itself functioning as the absolute final destination for every drop that ever reaches it. This particular arrangement is considerably rarer than the more familiar pattern followed by most rivers and lakes, where water continues its journey onward, eventually reaching the sea through some connected channel or outlet. Other terminal basins exist scattered across the planet, each one shaped by its own particular combination of enclosing geography and limited outward drainage, but few reach quite the same extreme concentration of dissolved mineral content this particular sea has managed to accumulate across its own especially long and especially arid history. The basic principle uniting all such basins remains the same everywhere it occurs: water arriving with nowhere left to go except upward into the sky, leaving behind everything it once carried within it. Given that no outlet exists here, carrying water back out toward any ocean, a natural question arises, worth sitting with for a moment before we continue any further. If water continues arriving here, year after year, century after century, carried down from the same distant highlands by the same steady river, why hasn't this basin simply continued filling, rising higher and higher, eventually overflowing its banks entirely? The answer lies in something we touched on briefly while standing at this shore a little earlier in tonight's journey: the particular heat and dryness defining this entire basin, sitting so far below ordinary sea level that sunlight arrives concentrated and intense, and air temperatures, especially through the long summer months, climb to levels considerably higher than almost anywhere else across the surrounding region. This heat drives evaporation at a pace considerably faster than most other bodies of water experience anywhere else on the surface of this planet. water rising continuously from the sea's own surface, carried upward into the thin, dry desert air surrounding this basin, escaping back into the atmosphere in a steady, unbroken process that has been operating here for as long as this particular sea has existed in anything resembling its current form. The particular combination of factors driving this rapid evaporation deserves a moment of its own attention, because more than heat alone contributes to it. The extremely low humidity typical of this surrounding desert plays its own considerable role. Dry air holding a much greater capacity to absorb additional moisture than air already saturated with humidity elsewhere, drawing water vapor upward from the sea's surface, with a persistence considerably greater than would occur above a similar body of water resting in a more humid climate. The frequent, steady winds moving across this basin add their own contribution too, continuously sweeping away whatever humid air has gathered just above the water's surface, replacing it constantly with drier air, still capable of absorbing considerably more moisture before reaching its own point of saturation. Picture this evaporation happening continuously across the entire surface of the sea, an invisible, ongoing exchange between water and air that never fully pauses, not through the cooler winter months, and certainly not through the intense heat of summer, when temperatures within this deep basin regularly climb high enough to make evaporation happen with genuine, visible urgency. This is, in fact, the only way water ever leaves this particular basin at all. There is no river carrying it back out toward any distant ocean. There is no underground channel draining it away towards some other hidden destination. The only path leading water out of this sea runs directly upward through evaporation, rising invisibly into the dry desert air before drifting away, eventually to become part of some entirely different stretch of the wider atmosphere, perhaps falling again someday as rain somewhere considerably distant from this basin, though carrying with it none of the minerals and salts it left behind in this water before finally rising free of it. For a very long stretch of this sea's history, this arrangement remained remarkably stable, water arriving steadily from the Jordan River and its smaller companions, and water departing steadily through evaporation, the two processes balancing one another closely enough that the sea's overall level remained, across centuries at a time, relatively consistent, rising slightly during wetter years, receding slightly during drier ones, but never departing dramatically from its own long-established equilibrium. This balance, inflow matching outflow so closely across such an extended stretch of time, represents something worth appreciating carefully, because it reveals just how finely tuned this particular basin's relationship with water has become across thousands of years of steady, unhurried adjustment. A sea receiving too little water would simply shrink and eventually vanish entirely, its basin left dry and empty, its cliffs rising above nothing but bare desert floor. A sea receiving too much would rise steadily, eventually overflowing whatever natural boundary contained it, spreading outward across the surrounding desert until it found some new equilibrium at a different, higher level. This particular sea, across the vast majority of its long history, has settled instead into a genuine, sustained balance, evaporation matching inflow closely enough that the overall system remained essentially stable, fluctuating gently within a fairly narrow range, but never departing dramatically from the same basic equilibrium sustained across an enormous stretch of geological and human time alike. Historical accounts and geological evidence alike suggest this sea's water level has shifted considerably across the very long span of its full existence, rising during particularly wet millennia, retreating somewhat during especially dry ones, its shoreline tracing a slow, patient rhythm shaped by broader shifts in regional climate, stretching back long before anything resembling recorded human history began. These older fluctuations, though genuinely significant across a long enough timescale, unfolded gradually enough that the basic character of this sea, its size, its shape, its general presence within this deep rift valley remained recognizably consistent across thousands of years at a stretch. We'll explore, a little further along in tonight's journey, exactly what has begun disrupting this long-standing balance in recent decades, and why the careful equilibrium sustained here for so many centuries has begun tipping, quite suddenly, by the standards of this basin's own patient history, toward a considerably more dramatic and considerably more visible retreat. For now, though, it's worth turning our attention towards something else entirely, something directly connected to this same process of constant, ongoing evaporation, and something that explains exactly why the water resting in this basin has become so remarkably, so famously salty. Every river carries, alongside its visible flow of water, an invisible cargo of dissolved minerals, gathered gradually as that water moves across rock and soil on its long journey from distant highland source to whatever final destination eventually receives it. The Jordan River, descending from its own considerably wetter, considerably higher source, carries this same kind of invisible mineral cargo, trace amounts of salt and other dissolved compounds, gathered slowly as the water moves across the particular rock and soil defining its own long path toward this basin. In most rivers, considered across their entire journey from source to sea, this dissolved mineral content remains relatively modest, diluted by the sheer volume of fresh water surrounding it, and eventually carried onward into whatever larger ocean finally receives the river's accumulated flow, where it disperses further still into a body of water so enormous that even a very long river's entire mineral contribution barely registers within the ocean's own already considerable salt content. Here, though, the situation unfolds rather differently, precisely because this particular sea has no outlet carrying its water and everything dissolved within it, onward toward any distant ocean. Whatever minerals the Jordan River carries down from its distant highland source arrive here in this enclosed basin, and then, exactly like the water itself, they have nowhere else to go. When water evaporates from the sea's own surface, rising into the dry desert air as pure, mineral-free vapor, it leaves behind everything it had been carrying, every trace of dissolved salt and mineral remaining exactly where the water once held it, now concentrated within a smaller volume of water than existed before that particular portion evaporated away. This process, repeated continuously across thousands of years, has produced something genuinely remarkable, a sea holding a concentration of dissolved minerals considerably higher than almost any other body of water found anywhere else on the surface of this planet. Picture this slow concentration happening across the entire span of this sea's existence. River water arriving continuously, carrying its own modest, steady contribution of dissolved minerals, and evaporation continuously removing pure water from the surface while leaving those same minerals behind, the overall concentration within the remaining water climbing gradually, year after year, century after century, never reversing, never diluting, only ever growing more concentrated as this same basic process repeats itself across a stretch of time considerably longer than any single human lifetime could properly witness. This accumulation resembles, in its basic pattern, something closer to a very slow distillation, water arriving carrying a small share of dissolved mineral, water departing carrying none at all, the remaining unevaporated portion left holding an ever larger proportion of whatever minerals the whole system has gathered across its entire history. Unlike an ordinary distillation, though happening quickly and deliberately within some contained vessel, this process has unfolded across a stretch of geological time reaching back many thousands of years, slow enough that no single observer could ever have watched the concentration climb from one year to the next, and yet steady enough that across that entire span, the resulting change has proven genuinely dramatic. The resulting salinity here reaches levels genuinely difficult to properly compare to anything found in more familiar bodies of water elsewhere on the planet. The ordinary open ocean, considered across its whole enormous volume, holds a salt concentration of roughly 3.5%, already enough to explain why seawater tastes so distinctly different from any freshwater lake or river. This particular sea, by comparison, holds a concentration considerably higher still, often measured at more than 30%, meaning that nearly a third of this water's entire mass consists of dissolved mineral content rather than water itself. This difference in scale is worth sitting with carefully because it represents something considerably more extreme than simply very salty water might initially suggest. Water this concentrated behaves in ways ordinary seawater simply doesn't. Its texture noticeably different beneath the hand, thicker, smoother, almost oily in a manner unlike anything found in any ordinary freshwater lake or conventional saltwater sea. Dip a hand into this water, and the sensation registers almost immediately as something unfamiliar, a faint, slippery resistance clinging to the skin even after the hand has been lifted back into open air, a residue that dries, before long, into a fine, pale dusting easily brushed away, though it returns again the moment skin touches water once more. This particular texture, distinct from anything encountered in ordinary seawater, reflects directly the extraordinary density of dissolved mineral content suspended within every portion of this remarkable sea. The particular minerals dissolved within this water matter too, worth understanding a little more closely before we continue any further into tonight's journey. Unlike ordinary seawater, where sodium chloride, the same simple compound found in ordinary table salt, dominates the overall mineral content considerably, this particular sea holds a more varied and, in certain ways, considerably more unusual combination of dissolved compounds. Magnesium appears here in significant quantity, alongside considerable amounts of calcium, potassium, and sodium as well, each contributing its own particular chemical character to the overall composition of this remarkably concentrated water. This particular mixture, considerably richer in magnesium than most other saline bodies of water found elsewhere on the planet, gives this sea's water its own distinct physical character, contributing to the smooth, almost slippery sensation felt against the skin, and to the particular density that will, a little further along in tonight's journey, allow anyone entering this water to float upon its surface with an ease found almost nowhere else on Earth. Each of these minerals arrived here by its own particular path, carried down originally from different stretches of rock and soil crossed by the Jordan River and its smaller tributary streams somewhere upstream, dissolved gradually over the course of that entire journey before finally arriving at this basin and joining the slow, patient accumulation building here across thousands of years. Calcium and magnesium, in particular, often originate from limestone and dolomite formations common throughout the surrounding highland terrain, gradually weathered and dissolved by rainfall and river flow alike before eventually reaching this final, enclosed destination. Our small crystal of salt, resting still at the water's edge where we first encountered it, represents, in its own small, precise way, a single tiny fragment of this same vast, patient process, one small portion of dissolved mineral finally reaching a concentration high enough in this particular stretch of drying shoreline to solidify back into visible crystalline form. Multiply this single crystal by the untold billions upon billions of similar formations scattered across this entire basin, accumulated gradually across thousands of years of steady evaporation, and you begin to understand the true scale of mineral concentration this ancient sea has managed to sustain across the whole of its long, patient history. This concentration didn't happen quickly. It couldn't have. It required exactly the kind of slow, patient accumulation this entire story has followed so closely tonight. River water arriving steadily, evaporation removing pure water continuously, minerals concentrating gradually within whatever water remained, repeated across a length of time considerably longer than any single human generation could properly witness on its own, building, drop by drop, mineral by mineral, toward the remarkable, extreme salinity this sea holds today. This sea's extraordinary saltiness isn't an isolated accident. It is the natural result of everything we've followed so far, a deep, enclosed basin receiving water from distant rivers and springs, while almost none of that water ever finds a path outward. Instead, water rises slowly from the surface through evaporation, leaving behind the minerals it once carried. Year after year, century after century, those minerals remain, gathering within the basin while the water itself gradually returns to the atmosphere. The same closed geography that traps the water here is what allows the sea's mineral concentration to keep increasing. Water arrives carrying dissolved material. Water leaves as vapor, and what remains becomes part of the sea itself. Even now, that process continues. Every drop entering this basin joins water already carrying an extraordinary amount of dissolved mineral content, while every drop that evaporates leaves the remaining water just a little more concentrated than before. Our crystal continues resting where it formed, small and precise and patient, one tiny fragment of a process that has been unfolding for thousands of years. And yet, the salt is only part of what makes this water so unusual. The same minerals that have gathered here for so long have changed the physical character of the sea itself, making its water far denser than ordinary seawater. That density creates something remarkable. A body entering this water is met not by the familiar feeling of sinking, but by an unusual upward force, as though the sea itself were quietly holding it at the surface. And along these silent shores, that simple physical property has become one of the most recognizable features of the Dead Sea. Standing at this shore, looking out across water so heavy with dissolved mineral that it seems to hold a weight beyond ordinary water, a question presents itself. In water this concentrated, this extreme, what could possibly manage to survive at all? The honest answer, for almost every kind of life familiar from ordinary lakes, rivers, or oceans, is nothing. No fish move through this water. No visible plants root themselves along its bed. No shellfish cling to rocks near its shore the way they might along an ordinary coastline. This sea earned its particular name precisely because of this apparent absence, water so hostile to conventional life that, for a very long stretch of recorded history, observers assumed nothing at all could exist within it. And yet, as the next stage of this exploration reveals, that assumption, however understandable, turns out to be not quite accurate. Something does live here. Something small and largely invisible, thriving within conditions that would prove instantly fatal to almost any other form of life found anywhere else on the surface of this planet. Travelers and naturalists writing about this sea across many centuries repeated a similar observation again and again, describing water so still, so heavy, so apparently barren, that its name seemed almost inevitable the moment anyone stood at its edge and looked out across its surface. Only much later, once instruments existed capable of examining this water at a scale far below what any unaided eye could ever hope to observe, did the fuller picture begin to emerge. To understand why ordinary life cannot survive within this particular water, it helps to consider what salt concentration this extreme actually does to the basic biological processes every living cell depends upon to function at all. Every cell, whether belonging to a fish, a plant, or any other familiar form of life, maintains a careful balance between the concentration of dissolved substances inside its own membrane and the concentration of dissolved substances in whatever water surrounds it. This balance matters enormously, because water itself tends to move across cell membranes toward whichever side holds a higher concentration of dissolved material, a basic physical process called osmosis, operating according to rules as fundamental and as consistent as gravity itself. In water carrying an ordinary, moderate concentration of dissolved salt, comparable to the salinity found within most fish or plant cells, this balance remains manageable, water moving gently in both directions without any dramatic net loss or gain. But place that same cell into water carrying dissolved mineral content many times more concentrated than anything found within its own membrane, and the balance collapses entirely. Water rushes outward, drawn by the overwhelming concentration gradient toward the considerably saltier water surrounding it, the cell itself losing moisture rapidly, shriveling and collapsing as its own internal water content is drawn forcibly away. This same basic principle governs why ordinary table salt has long been used to preserve food, drawing moisture forcibly out of whatever bacteria or microorganisms might otherwise cause spoilage. The salt itself creating exactly the kind of hostile, dehydrating environment this sea maintains across its entire, considerable volume every hour of every day, without any pause or exception. A cured fillet resting in salt for days, and a fish swimming briefly into this sea's own water undergo, at the cellular level, a remarkably similar fate. Moisture drawn steadily outward until nothing remains capable of sustaining ordinary function. This basic process explains, in fairly direct terms, why nothing resembling ordinary fish, plants, or larger aquatic creatures has ever managed to establish itself successfully within this particular sea. Any such creature entering this water would experience exactly this catastrophic loss of internal moisture, cells collapsing rapidly as the surrounding water's extreme mineral concentration draws moisture outward far faster than any ordinary biological process could hope to replace it. Even creatures adapted to tolerate moderately salty conditions, certain fish species capable of surviving in brackish estuaries where fresh river water meets ordinary seawater, find themselves entirely overwhelmed here, this sea's concentration reaching levels many times beyond anything even the hardiest conventional saltwater species has ever evolved the capacity to withstand. Occasionally, following unusually heavy rainfall, fish carried down from the Jordan River itself have been observed briefly at the point where fresh river water first meets this sea's considerably saltier surface. But these encounters end quickly, and predictably, the fish surviving only within the narrow, temporary zone where incoming fresh water has not yet fully mixed with the surrounding brine, perishing rapidly should they venture any further into the sea's own true, concentrated water. Along certain stretches of shoreline, particularly near the mouths of smaller freshwater springs, a visitor might notice small, pale shapes scattered across the drying mud a short distance from the water's edge, the remains of fish carried briefly into water considerably beyond anything their bodies could tolerate for more than a few passing moments. These small remains, bleached quickly by sun and salt alike, become themselves a kind of quiet marker, showing exactly where the boundary between survivable and unsurvivable water happens to fall on any given day, a boundary that shifts slightly with every change in river flow or seasonal rainfall feeding into the basin. And yet, despite this apparently overwhelming hostility toward ordinary biological life, something does survive here, something that has developed across an extraordinarily long stretch of evolutionary time, an entirely different biological strategy for managing exactly the kind of extreme osmotic pressure that proves instantly fatal to almost everything else. These are microorganisms belonging to a group scientists call Haloarchaea, single-celled organisms so thoroughly adapted to extreme salt concentration that they cannot survive at all in ordinary, less concentrated water, requiring instead exactly the kind of extreme conditions found within this particular sea and within a small handful of similarly hypersaline environments scattered elsewhere across the surface of this planet. Where an ordinary cell loses water catastrophically when placed within concentrated brine, these particular microorganisms have developed an entirely different internal chemistry, maintaining, within their own cellular structure, a concentration of dissolved salt closely matching, or in some cases even exceeding, the extreme concentration of the surrounding water itself. Rather than fighting against the osmotic pressure defining this particular environment, these organisms have simply adjusted their own internal balance to match it precisely, eliminating the dangerous gradient that would otherwise draw moisture catastrophically outward. This adjustment reaches down to the molecular level. The internal proteins of these organisms folded and structured in a manner considerably different from equivalent proteins found in ordinary cells, stable and functional, specifically within a chemical environment so concentrated it would cause most other biological molecules to fold incorrectly or fall apart entirely. Scientists studying these organisms have found their internal machinery essentially inverted compared to typical cellular chemistry, built from the ground up to require, rather than merely tolerate, the extreme salinity surrounding them. Some of these organisms carry within their own cell membranes a particular reddish pigment, related distantly to the pigment responsible for vision in more complex animals, capable of capturing a portion of the intense sunlight reaching this deep basin and converting it into a small, usable source of energy, an entirely separate strategy from ordinary photosynthesis, evolved independently to make use of exactly the kind of relentless, concentrated sunlight this particular basin receives in such abundance. These haloarchaea maintain their own particular internal chemistry through specialized proteins and cellular structures evolved specifically to remain stable and functional even while surrounded by and internally matching an almost saturated concentration of dissolved salt. This represents an extraordinarily specialized adaptation, the kind of biological solution that could only have developed gradually across countless generations within an environment maintaining exactly this particular extreme condition consistently enough and for long enough to reward organisms capable of tolerating it. Alongside these salt-loving microorganisms, certain specialized varieties of microalgae have also managed to establish themselves within this particular sea, similarly adapted to tolerate, and in fact require, the extreme salinity that would prove instantly fatal to almost any ordinary algae species found in more conventional bodies of water. These microalgae represent one of the very few forms of life within this sea capable of photosynthesis, drawing energy directly from sunlight in a manner considerably more familiar than the specialized chemistry sustaining the haloarchaea sharing this same extreme environment alongside them. These particular algae have developed their own defenses against the intense sunlight found within this deep, low basin, producing pigments that serve a dual purpose, protecting delicate internal structures from radiation while simultaneously contributing, under certain conditions, to the visible coloring of the water itself. This connection between microscopic survival strategy and visible surface appearance becomes especially apparent whenever conditions align to favor a sudden, dramatic increase in population. The relationship between these algae and the haloarchaea sharing the same water runs deeper than simple coexistence. In periods when algae populations expand considerably, drawing more directly on available sunlight, the haloarchaea populations sharing the same stretch of water often expand alongside them, feeding indirectly on organic material the algae release into the surrounding water. A small, quiet food web exists here, almost entirely beyond human sight, one organism's presence supporting another in a world too small to see from the shore. Under certain particular conditions, when temperature, sunlight, and the specific concentration of minerals within the water align in just the right combination, populations of these microalgae and haloarchaea can grow dramatically in number, producing what researchers call a bloom, a sudden, visible surge in microscopic population dense enough to actually change the appearance of the water itself across considerable stretches of the sea's surface. During these blooms, the water can take on a distinctly reddish or pinkish hue, the accumulated pigmentation of countless billions of individual microorganisms combining across the water's surface into something visible even from a considerable distance, a striking, unexpected color emerging from water otherwise holding the deep, uniform blue described earlier. These blooms don't occur constantly or predictably, appearing instead only when the particular combination of conditions favoring rapid microbial growth happens to align, sometimes remaining visible for a period of weeks before fading again as conditions shift and the bloom itself gradually subsides. The ordinary deep blue gradually gives way, over the course of several days, to something closer to a soft, dusty rose, deepening in certain particularly concentrated patches to something nearer a genuine, saturated red. The whole visible surface of this remarkable water transformed temporarily by nothing more than the accumulated presence of countless individual organisms too small to see with the naked eye, and yet numerous enough, together, to reshape the entire visible character of this ancient sea. Historical accounts describing this same body of water across many centuries occasionally mention exactly this kind of reddish tint appearing across its surface, a detail that puzzled earlier observers considerably before the underlying microbial cause was properly understood. What once seemed a strange, unexplainable occurrence now registers instead as one more visible expression of the same quiet, invisible ecosystem thriving throughout this water at every other moment, simply made briefly, dramatically visible whenever conditions allow its population to swell beyond its usual, ordinary density. Researchers monitoring the water across recent decades have noted that these blooms have grown somewhat less frequent as the sea's overall salinity has continued climbing. Certain conditions favorable to rapid algae growth becoming rarer as mineral concentration pushes toward levels even these hardy, specialized organisms find increasingly difficult to sustain large populations within. This detail connects the fate of this quiet, invisible ecosystem directly to the same broader story of shrinking and concentrating water explored elsewhere across this documentary. Life here shaped as thoroughly by the sea's slow transformation as anything visible along its retreating shoreline. This quiet, largely invisible ecosystem, thriving within conditions that would prove instantly fatal to almost any other form of life, deserves genuine appreciation. It would be easy, standing at this shore and looking out across water so obviously hostile to conventional life, to assume that nothing at all exists within it, that this sea has earned its particular name entirely and completely. But life, across the whole history of this planet, has proven remarkably persistent in finding some way to establish itself wherever even the smallest opportunity exists, however extreme or however apparently hostile the surrounding conditions might initially appear. This particular sea, hostile as it certainly remains toward almost every familiar form of life, has still managed to sustain its own particular, specialized ecosystem, adapted so precisely to the specific extreme conditions found here that these organisms could survive almost nowhere else on the entire surface of this planet. Similar haloarchaea populations have been documented in only a handful of comparably extreme environments scattered across the globe, certain hypersaline lakes in considerably distant regions, and a small number of similarly concentrated basins formed by comparable patterns of enclosed drainage and relentless evaporation. Each of these separate populations, though related in their basic biological strategy, has developed its own particular variations, shaped by whatever slightly different combination of minerals and conditions happens to define its own particular home. There is something worth sitting with quietly in this particular detail. A reminder that extreme conditions, however inhospitable they might initially appear, rarely represent the complete absence of life so much as an invitation for life to adapt in whatever particular direction that specific environment happens to demand. The same extreme salinity that prevents any ordinary fish or plant from surviving here has simultaneously created exactly the particular conditions certain highly specialized organisms require in order to thrive, conditions found in only a small handful of similarly extreme environments scattered elsewhere across the surface of this planet. Our crystal of salt, resting patiently at the water's edge, exists within the same basic chemistry sustaining this quiet, invisible ecosystem. The same concentrated mineral content that prevents ordinary life from establishing itself here, and that simultaneously provides exactly the particular conditions certain specialized microorganisms have evolved across countless patient generations to require. Having explored what can, against every ordinary expectation, actually survive within this remarkable water, another aspect of this same chemistry deserves attention, one that has drawn considerable curiosity from visitors to this particular shore for a very long stretch of recorded history. Stepping forward toward the water's edge and entering this sea directly means meeting water carrying a concentration of dissolved minerals so extreme that the body's own relationship with gravity itself seems, for a while, to shift entirely. The physical experience of entering this particular water differs from almost anything encountered in any other sea, lake, or ocean found elsewhere across the surface of this planet, and understanding why requires considering carefully and gently the basic physics of density and buoyancy that shape this experience so distinctly. Water, in its ordinary form, holds a particular density, a measure of how much mass exists within a given volume. Anything less dense than water, placed within it, will float, buoyed upward by the surrounding water's own greater density pressing against it from every direction. Anything denser than water will sink, its own weight overcoming whatever buoyant support the surrounding water might otherwise provide. An ordinary human body, floating in ordinary fresh water, sits remarkably close to this particular threshold, dense enough that most people, without deliberate effort, tend to sink at least partially beneath the surface, requiring some active swimming motion or deliberate positioning simply to remain afloat at all. In ordinary seawater, slightly denser than fresh water due to its own moderate salt content, floating becomes somewhat easier, the additional density of the surrounding water providing slightly more buoyant support than fresh water alone would offer. Here, though, in water carrying dissolved mineral content many times more concentrated than even the saltiest ordinary ocean, the situation shifts dramatically. This water's density exceeds, by a considerable margin, the density of an ordinary human body, meaning that anyone entering this particular sea experiences something considerably more dramatic than merely easier floating. Wading out slowly from the shore, the water rises gradually around the legs, the waist, the chest, each step revealing more clearly just how differently this particular water behaves compared to any ordinary sea or lake previously experienced. And then, at some point, without any particular deliberate effort, the feet simply lift away from the sandy or muddy floor beneath them, the entire body rising, buoyed upward by water so dense that sinking, in any ordinary sense, has become genuinely, physically impossible. This sensation, for anyone experiencing it for the first time, tends to register as something close to genuine astonishment. The body suddenly finding itself held aloft by water in a manner considerably more forceful, considerably more complete than anything encountered in any ordinary swimming experience. There is no need to kick, no need to paddle, no need to maintain any particular deliberate effort simply to remain afloat. The water itself does all of that work, its own extreme density providing far more buoyant support than any ordinary body requires simply to remain resting comfortably at the surface. Lying back gently within this water, allowing the shoulders and head to settle naturally against its dense, supportive surface, brings something close to genuine weightlessness, the sensation of gravity itself seeming, for a while, considerably less demanding than it does anywhere on ordinary dry land or within any ordinary body of water encountered elsewhere across the surface of this planet. The water holds the body here with a gentle, unwavering firmness, neither pulling it downward the way ordinary water eventually would, nor requiring any particular effort simply to maintain this restful, floating position. The limbs drift gently at the surface, barely needing any deliberate direction, the water's own extreme density managing nearly everything, leaving the body free simply to rest, entirely supported, entirely at ease, upon a surface considerably more forgiving than any ordinary sea has ever offered. Above, the sky stretches out in its own considerable stillness, the same pale, clear quality noted earlier, filtered through the thicker layer of atmosphere found only at this extreme, low elevation. There is something worth noticing in the particular contrast this creates. The heavy, dense, mineral-laden water beneath holding the body with such complete, effortless support, while above, the sky itself remains light, thin, and quiet, the whole scene settling into a particular kind of calm found almost nowhere else quite like it anywhere else on the surface of this planet. This floating experience connects directly back to everything explored so far. The same extreme mineral concentration that prevents ordinary fish and plants from surviving within this water is precisely what provides the extraordinary buoyancy allowing any human body to float upon its surface with such remarkable, effortless ease. The same slow, patient accumulation of dissolved salt across thousands of years of steady evaporation has produced not only a sea hostile to conventional life, but simultaneously a sea capable of supporting the human body in a manner found in only a small handful of similarly extreme, similarly concentrated bodies of water scattered elsewhere across this entire planet. Along much of this shoreline, this particular quality has become one of the most recognizable features associated with this sea, an experience unlike almost anything found elsewhere. Water so dense that effort itself becomes unnecessary, the body simply resting, held, without any need to struggle against a force that almost everywhere else on Earth requires at least some ongoing exertion to overcome. Held effortlessly by water dense enough to make sinking almost impossible, the body becomes strangely still beneath the open sky. The surrounding cliffs remain silent, the water barely moving beneath them, and for a moment the ordinary relationship between body and water seems completely reversed. Our crystal of salt, resting somewhere along the nearby shore, formed from exactly this same extraordinary chemistry, the same concentrated mineral content currently holding the body so effortlessly afloat, patient and precise, part of the very same slow process. One drop, one crystal, one quiet moment of floating stillness at a time. The buoyant, dense water sustaining that quiet, floating stillness has not always held the exact shape and volume it holds today. Along the length of this shoreline, evidence of an entirely different scale of water becomes increasingly visible, and it points toward a question that has grown considerably more urgent across recent decades. Where exactly has so much of this ancient sea's water actually gone? For thousands of years, the balance between water arriving through the Jordan River and water departing through evaporation remained close enough that this basin's overall size and shape stayed relatively consistent, generation after generation. In recent decades, that balance has shifted considerably, and understanding why requires looking closely at what has happened, not within this basin itself, but far upstream, along the entire length of the river system that has sustained this sea for so long. The Jordan River, before reaching this basin, passes through a landscape that has changed dramatically over the past century, populated increasingly by agricultural land, growing towns, and expanding infrastructure, each drawing upon the same river system that once flowed almost entirely, unimpeded, toward this deep, enclosed sea. Earlier generations living along this same river valley drew from it too, of course, but at a scale the river itself could absorb without any lasting disruption to its overall downstream flow, small-scale irrigation and modest settlement drawing only a negligible fraction of the river's total volume, leaving the great majority of its water free to continue its long, steady journey south toward the basin, waiting patiently at the bottom of this deep rift valley. What has changed across the past century is not the basic idea of drawing water from this river, but the scale at which that drawing now happens, multiplied many times over by populations and agricultural operations considerably larger than anything this same valley supported in earlier centuries. Modern agriculture across the region surrounding the river's upper and middle course requires considerable quantities of fresh water, drawn directly from the river itself or from the same underground aquifers connected to it, to irrigate crops across land that would otherwise remain too dry to cultivate reliably. This need has grown steadily across recent decades, populations expanding, agricultural land increasing, and with both, the total volume of water drawn from the river system before it ever has the chance to complete its full journey toward this sea. The particular crops grown across this region tend to require considerable irrigation across the warmer, drier months of the year, precisely the same stretch of the calendar when the river's own natural flow would otherwise be at its lowest, meaning agricultural demand, and the river's own seasonal scarcity often align in a way that places the greatest possible strain on whatever water remains available, during exactly the months when the basin further downstream would most benefit from a steady, reliable contribution. Beyond agriculture, considerable quantities of water are also diverted for drinking supply, serving the needs of growing towns and cities scattered throughout the wider region. This river once served almost exclusively as a natural, unmanaged source of downstream flow. Industrial use adds its own additional draw as well. Water diverted for processes considerably removed from anything resembling the river's own natural, historical function, carried away entirely from its original path before ever reaching the point where it might otherwise have continued flowing south toward the basin waiting at the bottom of this deep rift valley. Much of this diversion happens through a network of dams and reservoirs constructed along the river's course. Structures built specifically to capture and hold water that would otherwise continue flowing freely downstream, storing it instead for the varied and considerable needs of the communities and agricultural operations relying upon it. Each of these structures, considered individually, might seem a modest, localized intervention, holding back only a portion of the river's overall flow at any given point along its course. Considered together, though, across the entire length of the river system feeding this basin, their cumulative effect has proven genuinely dramatic. Where this river once carried a considerable, steady volume of water toward this sea across the whole span of a typical year, that volume has been reduced, by some estimates, to only a small fraction of what it once delivered before this pattern of upstream diversion began in earnest across the past several generations. What was once a genuine, substantial river, contributing meaningfully to sustaining an entire sea's worth of water, has become, along significant stretches of its lower course, something closer to a diminished, considerably reduced trickle, carrying only a portion of the volume this same river once delivered reliably, year after year, for thousands of years before these modern patterns of diversion began. Each reservoir along this system serves its own particular, immediate purpose, storing water through wetter months for release during drier ones, buffering agricultural regions against the natural variability of seasonal rainfall, and providing a stable, reliable supply for towns and cities that would otherwise remain considerably more vulnerable to the river's own natural, unmanaged fluctuations. None of these purposes exists in isolation from the others, and none of them was originally designed with any particular consideration for the considerably more distant sea waiting at the very end of this entire river system's long southward course. This pattern of diversion did not emerge all at once, arriving instead gradually across successive decades, each new reservoir or irrigation project adding its own additional draw to a river system already carrying a considerable cumulative burden from everything constructed before it. Considered individually, at the moment any single project was first proposed, its own particular impact on the distant sea downstream likely seemed modest, easily absorbed by a river system that had, across thousands of years, always managed to deliver a considerable, reliable volume toward this basin regardless of whatever minor variations occurred along its course. It was only across the accumulated span of many such projects, layered one atop another across successive generations, that the true scale of the overall reduction became clear. This reduction becomes particularly clear when comparing historical records of the river's flow to measurements taken more recently. Accounts and measurements from earlier generations describe a river carrying a volume of water considerably greater than anything documented within recent decades, evidence of just how dramatically this particular water source has been reshaped by the accumulated demands of modern agriculture, modern infrastructure, and modern population growth across the wider region this river system serves. Along certain stretches of the river's lower course, closest to where it once emptied its full, considerable volume into this waiting sea, the difference becomes visible even to a casual observer. A channel that once carried a genuine, flowing river now reduced, in many places, to something considerably narrower, considerably shallower, carrying only a fraction of the water this same channel once held, reliably throughout every season of the year. In certain sections nearest the sea itself, the river's remaining flow has grown so reduced that what water does continue arriving carries, alongside whatever fresh water remains, an increasing proportion of water previously used for agricultural irrigation or other purposes upstream, returned eventually to the river's channel only after having already served some other function elsewhere along its considerably altered course. This water, though still technically reaching the sea, arrives carrying a composition considerably different from the pure, unaltered mountain water that once defined this river's entire historical contribution to the basin below. The riverbed itself, along these lower, most reduced stretches, has changed shape considerably as a direct consequence of this diminished flow. Channels once wide enough to carry a substantial, steady current, now narrowed by vegetation encroaching from the banks on either side. The river's own reduced volume no longer sufficient to keep these margins clear the way its earlier, more substantial flow. Once managed as a simple, ordinary consequence of moving considerably more water across the same stretch of ground. Beyond the reduction of river water reaching this basin directly, another significant factor has contributed to the accelerating loss of this sea's overall volume, one connected not to the river itself, but to activity happening within the southern portion of the basin, closer to the sea's own shoreline. Industrial operations in this region extract valuable minerals directly from this sea's own extraordinarily concentrated water, drawing upon the same dense, mineral-rich chemistry explored earlier in this documentary. This extraction process typically involves directing considerable quantities of the sea's water into large, shallow evaporation ponds spread across a substantial area of the basin's southern reaches, allowing the intense desert sun to accelerate the same natural evaporation process this sea has always experienced, though now concentrated deliberately within these constructed ponds rather than occurring gradually across the sea's own, much larger natural surface. Viewed from a considerable height, these evaporation ponds form an unmistakable pattern across the southern portion of this basin. Geometric shapes considerably more regular and considerably more deliberate than anything found along the sea's own natural, irregular shoreline further north, each pond holding its own particular stage of the extraction process, some still relatively fresh, others considerably more concentrated, their water taking on distinct, often strikingly vivid colors depending on exactly which minerals and organisms happen to dominate that particular pond's own, especially concentrated chemistry. This geometric pattern stands in deliberate, striking contrast against the surrounding desert and the sea's own natural, winding shoreline further north. A landscape shaped here not by millions of years of patient tectonic movement, but by comparatively recent engineering decisions, each pond's boundary and depth calculated specifically to maximize how efficiently the sun's heat can be put to use extracting whatever particular mineral that section of the operation happens to be targeting. Within these evaporation ponds, water drawn from the sea evaporates considerably faster than it would if left within the sea's own larger, deeper body. The shallow depth and considerable surface area of each individual pond specifically designed to maximize the rate at which the sun draws moisture upward into the surrounding desert air. As this water evaporates, valuable minerals, the same dissolved magnesium, potassium, and other compounds explored earlier, become concentrated within the remaining water, eventually reaching a purity sufficient for commercial extraction and processing. This industrial process, valuable as it has proven for regional economies relying upon these extracted minerals, adds its own considerable contribution to the overall volume of water lost from this basin each year, water drawn deliberately from the sea itself and evaporated at an accelerated pace within these constructed ponds, rather than being permitted to remain within the sea's own larger, more gradually evaporating body. Researchers studying this basin's overall water balance have found that evaporation occurring within these industrial ponds accounts for a genuinely significant share of the sea's total annual water loss, comparable in scale to a meaningful portion of what evaporates naturally from the sea's own considerably larger surface elsewhere across the basin. This detail matters considerably for understanding the full picture of this sea's ongoing retreat, since it reveals that the imbalance driving this retreat stems not from any single, isolated cause, but from several distinct factors operating simultaneously, each contributing its own particular share to an overall deficit considerably larger than any one factor alone could fully explain. The particular minerals extracted through this process serve considerable value across a range of industries considerably distant from this basin itself: fertilizer production, various chemical manufacturing processes, and other applications that rely on exactly the kind of concentrated magnesium and potassium compounds this sea's own extreme chemistry has spent thousands of years slowly accumulating. This economic value creates its own particular pressure toward continuing, and in certain periods expanding, this same extraction process, a pressure operating somewhat independently from any consideration of the sea's own overall shrinking volume. Considering all of these factors together, reduced river inflow, diverted water for agriculture and drinking supply, and accelerated evaporation within industrial extraction ponds, the fundamental arithmetic sustaining this sea's historical equilibrium has shifted considerably. Where inflow and evaporation once balanced one another closely enough to sustain a relatively stable water level across centuries at a time, the modern picture looks considerably different. Evaporation continuing at essentially its same historical pace, or in the case of the extraction ponds, at an even accelerated pace, while inflow has been reduced dramatically by the accumulated demands of modern agriculture, modern infrastructure, and modern industry. This imbalance, evaporation continuing steadily while inflow diminishes considerably, produces exactly the kind of net water loss that has become increasingly visible across this basin over recent decades, the sea's overall volume shrinking year after year as evaporation continues removing water at a pace the diminished modern river system simply cannot match through its own considerably reduced natural contribution. This fundamental deficit, far more water leaving this basin through evaporation than arrives to replace it, explains, in fairly direct terms, why the shoreline surrounding this sea has begun retreating so visibly and so measurably across recent decades, a pattern considerably more dramatic than anything this particular basin experienced across the vast majority of its earlier, much longer history. The scale of this ongoing retreat deserves careful attention because it reveals just how significant this modern imbalance has actually become. Measurements taken along this shoreline in recent years have documented a water level dropping by more than a metre annually, a rate of decline considerably faster than anything recorded across earlier stretches of this sea's history, when natural fluctuations, driven by broader shifts in regional climate rather than concentrated human diversion, tended to unfold across a considerably slower, considerably gentler timescale. Across the span of several recent decades, this steady annual decline has accumulated into a truly substantial overall drop in the sea's surface elevation, considerably more significant than anything recorded across comparable stretches of this basin's much longer geological history. Earlier fluctuations, driven by shifting rainfall patterns across many centuries, produced changes measured gradually across generations. This modern decline has produced a comparable, in some respects even greater, overall change within a span of time short enough that people who visited this shoreline as children have returned decades later to find the water's edge sitting a considerable distance from wherever they remember it standing during their own earliest visits. Walking along stretches of shoreline where this retreat has proven most dramatic reveals a landscape reshaping itself with a pace considerably faster than most geological processes explored across previous documentaries on this channel. Ground that held water only a decade or two earlier now sits considerably inland from the sea's current edge, exposed mudflats and dry, cracked earth stretching outward across territory the sea itself has, within living memory, entirely abandoned. Old structures built along what was once considered a stable, permanent shoreline now sit stranded considerably inland, former beaches and resort facilities positioned, when originally constructed, directly adjacent to the water's edge, now separated from that same water by a considerable stretch of newly exposed, increasingly dry ground. This pattern repeats itself at numerous points scattered around the sea's entire perimeter, each location offering its own particular, visible record of just how far the water has retreated within a span of time considerably shorter than a single human lifetime. Facilities built decades earlier specifically to offer direct access to the sea's own particular, buoyant water now require considerably longer walks, or in some cases dedicated transportation, simply to reach the water's current edge. The original, carefully planned proximity between structure and shoreline dissolved gradually by a retreat neither the original builders nor the earliest visitors could have fully anticipated at the time these facilities were first established. Roads and pathways constructed to connect these older facilities directly to the water's edge now extend across ground considerably drier than whatever they were originally built to cross, some ending abruptly at what was once a natural shoreline and now stretches on, instead into open mudflat, the water itself visible only as a distant line along the horizon rather than the immediate presence these paths were originally designed to reach. Certain cliff faces surrounding portions of this basin carry their own visible record of this ongoing retreat, distinct bands and markings along the exposed rock showing clearly where the water's surface once rested at various points across recent decades, each successive marking positioned lower than the one recorded before it, a kind of natural, unintentional record keeping pace with the sea's own steady, continuing decline. This visible record, etched gradually into the surrounding stone by decades of steadily retreating water, offers a particularly clear illustration of just how significant this modern change has become, especially when compared against the much longer, much more gradual fluctuations recorded across earlier stretches of this sea's considerably longer geological history, where those earlier changes unfolded across centuries, shaped by broad, natural shifts in regional climate. This current retreat has unfolded within mere decades, driven considerably more directly by the accumulated impact of modern human activity across the entire river system feeding this basin. Geologists studying these markings alongside the deeper sediment layers preserved beneath the modern seabed have been able to compare this current, rapid decline against the sea's own much longer geological record, confirming that nothing quite comparable in terms of sheer pace appears anywhere else across the many thousands of years this particular basin has held water in some recognizable form. The rock itself, in this sense, tells a story considerably more precise than memory alone could offer, each successive band a quiet, physical confirmation of exactly how far and exactly how quickly this ancient shoreline has continued its retreat. The changing landscape surrounding this retreating shoreline continues reclaiming ground from the sea at a pace visible even within the span of a few consecutive years, exposed seabed gradually hardening and cracking under the same relentless desert sun explored earlier in this documentary, eventually developing its own particular character, distinct from both the wet, active shoreline closer to the water's current edge and the older, considerably drier desert terrain surrounding the wider basin. Along this newly exposed ground, a visitor might notice remnants of the sea's own earlier presence scattered across what has, within a relatively short span of years, become considerably drier, considerably more distant territory, thin crusts of salt still clinging to ground the water abandoned only recently, gradually thinning and dispersing further as wind and whatever rare rainfall occurs continue, reshaping this newly exposed surface. This newly exposed ground does not remain entirely static once the water has withdrawn from it. Beneath its drying surface, an entirely separate process has begun quietly unfolding, one connected directly to the ancient layers of buried salt left behind by this sea's own much earlier, much higher water levels, layers that fresh groundwater, still moving steadily beneath this retreating shoreline, has begun dissolving away from underneath, hollowing out spaces the surface above knows nothing about until, quite suddenly, it does. The retreat has now exposed a landscape that once belonged beneath the sea, and beneath that newly exposed ground, another change is beginning. Ancient layers of salt remain buried below the surface, while groundwater moves quietly through them, dissolving passages beneath the drying earth. The surface may look solid and empty, but beneath it, the ground is becoming increasingly fragile. And in places where those hidden spaces grow large enough, the surface can suddenly give way. Beneath that same newly exposed ground, where fresh groundwater continues moving quietly through layers the retreating sea has only recently abandoned, an entirely different kind of transformation has been taking shape, one considerably less visible than the retreating shoreline itself, and considerably more sudden in how it finally reveals itself to the surface above. To understand this transformation, it helps to return, briefly, to the sea's own much earlier history, and to the water levels this basin held at various points across the many centuries before the modern retreat explored in the previous stage of this documentary ever began. Across the thousands of years, this sea has occupied its position within this deep rift valley. Its water level has never remained perfectly fixed, rising somewhat during particularly wet centuries, receding somewhat during especially dry ones, tracing a slow, patient rhythm shaped by broader shifts in regional climate stretching back long before anything resembling recorded history began. At various points across this long, fluctuating history, the sea's surface sat considerably higher than it does today, its water extending across territory that now sits, in the present, as dry desert ground considerably removed from the water's current, much reduced edge. As this ancient water occupied that higher, more extensive territory across those earlier centuries, it left behind, wherever it eventually receded from any particular stretch of ground, the same kind of mineral residue explored throughout the earlier stages of this documentary, layers of salt and other dissolved compounds settling gradually beneath whatever surface soil eventually developed above, them buried deeper and deeper as subsequent centuries deposited their own additional layers of sediment and mineral above these earlier, more ancient deposits. Some of these ancient layers formed during periods considerably wetter than the climate this region experiences today, stretches of centuries when rainfall across the surrounding highlands arrived in greater abundance, feeding a river system carrying considerably more water toward this basin than even the historical, pre-modern Jordan explored earlier managed to deliver. During these wetter centuries, the sea's surface climbed correspondingly higher, its shoreline advancing across territory that, in later, drier centuries, would eventually become exposed again as the water gradually receded back toward a lower, more typical equilibrium, leaving behind, at each successive stage of that ancient retreat, its own particular layer of concentrated mineral residue. Geologists can use these buried layers, including cores drilled through successive strata, to reconstruct a long record of the basin's changing water levels, extending far beyond the period preserved by the more recent shoreline markings, each layer corresponding to a particular stretch of centuries when the sea's surface rested at that exact elevation, rising or falling according to whatever broader climate pattern happened to dominate the surrounding region during that particular era. This buried record extends back considerably further than anything preserved along the more recent cliff markings explored earlier, offering a window into fluctuations that occurred long before anything resembling written history existed anywhere near this basin. These buried layers of ancient salt, some resting only a modest distance beneath the current surface, others considerably deeper, represent a kind of hidden geological inheritance, a record of this sea's own earlier, higher water levels preserved now beneath ground that, in the present, often sits a considerable distance from the water's current, much reduced shoreline. For a very long stretch of time, these buried layers remained essentially stable, protected from further dissolution by the same dry, arid conditions defining the surrounding desert terrain above them. What has changed across recent decades connects directly back to the same retreating shoreline explored in the previous stage of this documentary. As the sea's surface has continued dropping, the water table beneath the surrounding land, the level at which groundwater naturally sits within the surrounding soil and rock, has been forced to adjust as well, seeking its own new equilibrium in response to the considerably lower water level now defining the sea itself. This adjustment does not happen instantly, groundwater levels responding instead with their own particular lag, gradually settling toward a new equilibrium across a period of months or years following any significant shift in the sea's own surface elevation. This lag means the underground dissolution process explored throughout this section of the documentary often continues, actively reshaping ground the sea itself abandoned considerably earlier. The surface retreat and the underground consequences of that retreat unfolding on two related but distinctly separate timelines. This adjustment has set fresh groundwater, drawn from various sources scattered throughout the wider basin, moving through underground channels toward the sea's own considerably lowered surface, following the same basic downhill pull that shapes the movement of water everywhere else across the surface of this planet. Along the way, this moving fresh groundwater encounters the ancient, buried layers of salt left behind by the sea's own earlier, higher water levels. Layers that have rested largely undisturbed for centuries, protected until now by conditions considerably drier and considerably more stable than what currently exists as this fresh, actively moving water passes through them. Salt, unlike many other minerals found within the surrounding rock and soil, dissolves readily when it comes into sustained contact with fresh, unsaturated water, considerably more readily, in fact, than nearly any other mineral compound commonly found within this particular landscape. As this fresh groundwater moves steadily through and around these ancient, buried salt layers, it begins dissolving them gradually, carrying dissolved mineral content away with it as it continues its own slow, patient journey toward the sea's considerably lowered surface. This groundwater comes from several sources across the basin, including rainfall and water associated with agriculture. Once it enters the underground system, the chemistry is the same. Fresh water encounters soluble salt and begins dissolving it, seeping down from cultivated land established across the newly exposed territory explored in the previous stage of this documentary. Regardless of its particular origin, once this water enters the underground system surrounding the buried salt layers, it behaves according to the same basic chemistry, dissolving whatever soluble mineral content it happens to encounter along its own particular path toward the sea. This dissolution does not happen evenly or uniformly across every buried salt deposit it encounters. It happens instead in a manner considerably more concentrated and considerably more localized, fresh water finding whatever particular paths of least resistance happen to exist within the surrounding rock and soil, following cracks and channels and porous stretches of ground more readily than it moves through denser, less permeable material nearby. Along these particular paths, dissolution happens considerably faster than elsewhere, gradually hollowing out empty spaces within what were once solid, continuous layers of buried salt. Over time, as this process continues, these hollowed spaces grow considerably larger, empty caverns forming gradually beneath the surface, invisible from above, their presence entirely unknown to anyone walking across the ordinary-looking desert ground resting directly atop them. These underground caverns continue growing steadily as fresh groundwater continues its slow, patient dissolution of the ancient salt deposits surrounding them, expanding gradually across months and years, entirely hidden from any direct observation from the surface above. The particular shape each cavern eventually takes depends considerably on the specific structure of the buried salt layer it forms within, some hollowing out into long, narrow channels following whatever crack or fissure first allowed groundwater to penetrate the deposit, others expanding more broadly into wider, dome-shaped voids where the surrounding salt happened to be more uniformly soluble across a larger stretch of buried ground. This variation in shape matters considerably once collapse eventually occurs, determining whether the resulting sinkhole appears as a narrow, deep shaft or a wider, shallower depression spread across a broader stretch of surface. Eventually, given enough time and enough continued dissolution, one of these underground caverns grows large enough that the ground resting directly above it can no longer support its own weight. When this finally happens, the surface collapses suddenly and dramatically, the ground giving way all at once to reveal the hollow space that has, until this exact moment, remained entirely hidden beneath what appeared, from above, to be perfectly ordinary, stable desert terrain. This collapse produces what geologists and local observers alike call a sinkhole, a sudden, often quite deep and quite circular depression appearing abruptly where solid ground had, only moments before, seemed entirely stable and entirely unremarkable. These sinkholes vary considerably in their particular size and depth, some modest enough to represent only a minor, localized depression, others considerably larger and considerably more dramatic, opening suddenly to reveal a depth extending many meters below the surrounding surface, their steep, often nearly vertical walls exposing the layered soil and rock that had, until the moment of collapse, remained entirely hidden from view. The particular danger these sinkholes present connects directly to their own sudden, unpredictable nature. Unlike the gradual, visible retreat of the shoreline explored in the previous stage of this documentary, a change unfolding slowly enough that anyone observing this basin across successive years could track its progress with reasonable confidence, these sinkholes offer no comparable warning. The ground above a growing underground cavern typically shows little to no visible sign of the hollow space developing beneath it, right up until the precise moment collapse actually occurs, transforming what had appeared, only moments before, to be perfectly stable, walkable terrain into a sudden, often quite deep depression. This unpredictability has reshaped how people move through and interact with the newly exposed ground surrounding this retreating shoreline. Considerable caution now required across stretches of territory that only a few decades earlier would have remained safely submerged beneath the sea zone, then considerably higher water level. Areas once considered perfectly ordinary desert ground, or in some cases former beach and resort territory explored in the previous stage of this documentary, now require careful assessment before anyone considers walking across them, the visible, stable surface offering no reliable guarantee about whatever hollow, unstable space might exist just beneath it. The sheer number of these sinkholes appearing across this basin in recent decades illustrates just how extensively this underground dissolution process has been unfolding beneath the newly exposed shoreline. Thousands of individual sinkholes have appeared scattered across various stretches of territory surrounding this retreating sea, their numbers continuing to grow year after year as fresh groundwater continues its steady, ongoing dissolution of whatever buried salt deposits remain within reach of its own particular path. Certain stretches of this exposed shoreline have proven particularly susceptible to this pattern. Clusters of sinkholes appearing in close proximity to one another, transforming what was once relatively uniform, flat desert terrain into something considerably more textured and considerably more treacherous, pocked with depressions of varying size and depth, some appearing only recently, others considerably older, their edges already beginning to soften and erode under the same relentless desert sun and occasional rare rainfall shaping every other stretch of exposed ground within this basin. Older sinkholes, given enough additional time, begin their own gradual transformation, wind-blown sand, and whatever loose sediment happens to accumulate nearby slowly softening their once sharp edges, occasional rare rainfall carrying additional material down into their exposed interior, gradually filling and reshaping what began as a sudden, sharp-edged collapse into something closer to a broader, gentler depression, still visibly distinct from the surrounding terrain, but no longer carrying quite the same freshly opened, precarious quality of a sinkhole formed only recently. In certain particularly active clusters, new sinkholes have opened close enough to older, already softened depressions that their combined presence has begun reshaping entire stretches of shoreline into something considerably different from the smooth, gently sloping terrain that characterized this same territory only a generation or two earlier, an increasingly cratered, uneven surface taking shape. Across ground that had, for thousands of years before the modern retreat began, remained relatively stable and predictable. Researchers studying this particular phenomenon have documented the appearance of new sinkholes with a frequency considerably higher than most people unfamiliar with this basin's particular geology might initially expect. New collapses occurring regularly enough that certain stretches of shoreline require ongoing monitoring, considerable effort invested in tracking exactly where the underlying dissolution process appears most active, and where the surface above therefore carries the greatest risk of sudden, unexpected collapse. This monitoring effort connects directly back to the same fundamental retreat explored throughout the earlier stages of this documentary. As the sea's shoreline continues its steady retreat, the boundary between stable, long-established ground and newly exposed, potentially hollow territory continues shifting as well, meaning the particular stretches of land requiring the most careful monitoring change gradually over time, following the same retreating water that first exposed this vulnerable ground to the fresh groundwater dissolution process in the first place. Some of the methods used to monitor this ongoing risk involve tracking subtle shifts in ground elevation across successive surveys, measuring for the kind of gradual settling that sometimes, though not always, precedes an eventual collapse. Other approaches involve mapping the known extent of buried ancient salt deposits directly, allowing researchers to identify, with somewhat greater confidence, which particular stretches of newly exposed ground sit above the kind of buried mineral layer most likely to produce a future sinkhole, even before any actual collapse has occurred at that particular location. This mapping effort has grown increasingly sophisticated across recent years, combining older geological surveys of the buried salt layers with more recent measurements of exactly where and how quickly new sinkholes have appeared, gradually building a more complete picture of which particular stretches of shoreline carry the greatest ongoing risk, and which, by contrast, appear to rest above ground, considerably less susceptible to this same underlying dissolution process. Picture the underlying mechanism driving this entire phenomenon one more time, because it connects so many different threads explored across this documentary so far into a single, coherent process. Ancient salt left behind by this sea's own earlier, higher water levels across thousands of years of gradual accumulation rests buried beneath ground that, for a very long stretch of time, remained stable and protected. The sea's modern, accelerated retreat, driven by the reduced river inflow and increased evaporation explored in the previous stage of this documentary, has lowered the surrounding water table considerably, setting fresh groundwater moving toward the sea's own considerably reduced surface. This moving groundwater encounters the ancient buried salt along its path, dissolving it gradually, hollowing out underground caverns that eventually, given sufficient time, cause the surface above to collapse suddenly and dramatically. Each individual thread within this process connects directly to something explored earlier in this documentary: the ancient mineral accumulation shaping this sea's extreme salinity, the modern retreat driven by reduced river inflow and industrial extraction, and now, finally, this quiet, largely invisible underground dissolution hidden entirely from view until the precise moment it finally, suddenly, reveals itself as a sinkhole opening abruptly within ground that had, until that exact moment, seemed perfectly ordinary and perfectly stable. Standing near one of these sinkholes, close enough to look down into its steep, often quite deep interior, offers its own particular kind of perspective on this whole unfolding story. The exposed walls reveal, in cross-section, the layered history of this particular stretch of ground, pale, compacted soil near the surface giving way, deeper down, to darker, denser layers, and occasionally visible along certain exposed edges, faint traces of the same crystalline salt deposits that, dissolved gradually by patient groundwater, created the hollow space this collapse has now revealed. This exposed cross-section offers a kind of unintentional geological record, considerably more direct and considerably more immediate than the gradual markings left behind along the retreating cliff faces explored in the previous stage of this documentary, where those cliff markings recorded the sea's own gradual retreat across recent decades. These sinkhole walls reveal something considerably older, glimpses into layers of accumulated sediment and buried mineral reaching back, in certain cases, across a stretch of time considerably longer than the modern retreat itself, exposed now only because the particular combination of ancient salt and modern groundwater happened to align in this exact spot in a manner that finally caused the ground above to give way. At the very bottom of certain deeper sinkholes, where the original cavern's shape remains most clearly visible before subsequent erosion has had time to soften it, faint traces of standing water sometimes gather following whatever rare rainfall happens to reach this particular stretch of desert, a small, temporary pool resting at the base of a depression that owes its own existence entirely to the dissolving, patient work of groundwater moving quietly beneath the surface across however many preceding months or years it finally took to hollow out this particular space. The crystal of salt followed throughout this documentary exists within the same basic chemistry driving this entire underground process, the same mineral compound, concentrated originally through thousands of years of evaporation along this sea's own surface, now dissolving away beneath newly exposed ground through an entirely different, though closely related, chemical process, where evaporation concentrates dissolved salt within remaining water, leaving crystals behind wherever that water eventually recedes. Fresh groundwater performs essentially the reverse operation, dissolving already solid salt back into liquid solution, carrying it away, hollowing out spaces that eventually collapse into the sudden, dramatic depressions scattered increasingly across this retreating shoreline. This reversal, salt first forming through evaporation and later dissolving through fresh groundwater contact, illustrates something worth sitting with quietly: the recognition that this entire landscape exists in a state of continuous, ongoing chemical transformation, never fully settled, never fully finished, shaped by whichever particular combination of evaporation, mineral concentration, and fresh water contact happens to dominate any given stretch of ground at any particular moment across this sea's own long, continuing history. Beyond the sinkholes themselves, this same underground dissolution process has begun reshaping certain other aspects of the landscape surrounding this retreating shoreline, subtle shifts and settling occurring across ground that hasn't yet experienced the kind of dramatic, sudden collapse defining a true sinkhole, but which nonetheless shows signs, to anyone looking closely enough, of the same underlying dissolution quietly continuing somewhere beneath its surface. Certain roads and pathways constructed across this newly exposed territory have required ongoing repair and occasional complete rerouting. Engineers responsible for maintaining safe passage across this shifting landscape forced to work considerably more cautiously than they might elsewhere, aware that ground appearing perfectly stable on any given day might, without much additional warning, prove otherwise, before too many additional months have passed. Agricultural operations that once expanded confidently into this newly exposed territory, drawn by the availability of fresh, previously submerged ground, have in certain cases needed to reconsider or relocate portions of their own activity, the underlying instability threatening infrastructure and cultivated land alike, in a manner that has required an entirely new kind of caution, one that generations working this same basin in earlier centuries, before the sea's modern acceleration began, never needed to seriously consider. This entire phenomenon, thousands of sinkholes scattered across a shoreline retreating more rapidly than at any earlier point in this sea's long, patient history, represents one of the more visibly dramatic consequences of everything explored across this documentary so far: the ancient mineral accumulation, the modern imbalance between inflow and evaporation, and now this quiet, largely hidden underground dissolution, all connecting together into a single, continuous story unfolding across this remarkable ancient basin. The salt beneath this landscape is therefore not simply a remnant of the past. It remains part of a process that is still unfolding, slowly dissolving in some places while the surface above continues to change. And so the retreating sea has left behind something stranger than an empty shoreline. Beneath the exposed ground, the landscape itself is being quietly rewritten. Not by waves, but by groundwater moving through ancient layers of salt, one hidden cavity at a time. Along the water's own present edge, an entirely different fate awaits, one considerably more visible than anything hollowing out beneath the sinkholes explored in the previous stage of this documentary, and one connected directly back to the very first crystal introduced at the beginning of this whole story. Where this sea's dense, mineral-saturated water meets dry air and warm stone, precipitation happens continuously, the same basic chemistry explored earlier in this documentary, water evaporating and leaving behind whatever dissolved mineral it once carried, but here concentrated into forms considerably more dramatic and considerably more visible than the single, small crystal followed so closely throughout. This entire journey, along stretches of shoreline where this sea's water regularly rises and recedes, following whatever seasonal or daily fluctuation happens to shape its surface at any given time, a particular pattern of mineral buildup accumulates steadily across rocks and stones sitting at the boundary between wet and dry ground. Each time water rises high enough to submerge these rocks, it deposits a thin layer of dissolved mineral across their surface as it eventually recedes and evaporates away. Repeated across countless cycles of rising and falling water, this thin, repeated deposit gradually builds into something considerably thicker, a hardened, crystalline crust accumulating layer upon layer across whatever stone or rock face happens to sit within this particular zone of repeated wetting and drying. This crust holds its own particular texture, rough and jagged in places where crystal growth has proceeded somewhat irregularly, smoother and more polished in other spots where repeated water contact has worn the accumulated mineral into something closer to a naturally formed glaze. Sunlight striking this crust catches on countless small, individual crystal faces scattered across its surface, producing a scattered, sparkling quality distinct from the smoother reflection found across the open water itself. The particular thickness of this crust varies considerably from one stretch of shoreline to the next, depending largely on how frequently that particular section of rock experiences the rising and falling water responsible for each new layer of deposit. Along sections where the water's edge fluctuates most regularly, following daily patterns of evaporation and whatever modest inflow continues arriving from the reduced river system explored earlier, the crust tends to build thickest and most continuously. Along sections positioned somewhat higher, reached only during the sea's own occasional, more substantial rises, the crust instead forms in more distinct, separate bands, each one marking a particular historical high point the water managed to reach before receding once again. Further along certain stretches of this same shoreline, particularly in areas where mineral-rich water has pooled and evaporated repeatedly across a considerable span of years, something considerably more dramatic than a simple crust has begun taking shape. Tall, irregular columns of pure salt rise from the ground in certain locations, formed gradually as water-carrying dissolved mineral repeatedly rose around a particular fixed point, perhaps an old branch, a partially submerged rock, or simply an irregularity in the underlying ground, and then receded, leaving behind its own small deposit before the next cycle of rising water began the whole process again. Across many such cycles, repeated over years and sometimes decades, these formations grow steadily taller and more elaborate, their surfaces gathering additional layers of crystal with each successive evaporation, gradually taking on shapes considerably more organic and considerably more varied than anything a deliberate, planned construction might have produced. Some rise as relatively narrow, tapering columns, not unlike the mineral formations found within certain limestone caves explored on other evenings, though built here through an entirely different process, evaporation rather than the slow dripping accumulation typical of cave formations elsewhere. Other formations grow wider at their base, while some develop unusual, almost sculptural shapes. Each new layer of crystal follows the irregular surface beneath it, gradually adding to whatever form the previous layer has created. Certain particularly striking examples of these salt formations have taken on shapes local observers have, across generations, come to recognize and even name individually their particular silhouettes distinct enough and stable enough across successive years to become recognizable landmarks along this otherwise continuously shifting shoreline. These formations stand as pale, ghostly presences against the surrounding desert backdrop, catching the day's changing light in a manner that shifts their appearance considerably from morning to evening, pale and almost translucent under the harsh light of midday, deepening toward warmer, more golden tones as the sun approaches the horizon each evening. Some of these formations have grown large and stable enough to persist across many years, their basic structure surviving despite the same evaporation and occasional rare rainfall reshaping so much of the surrounding landscape. Others prove considerably more fragile, their delicate, jagged structure eventually collapsing under its own accumulated weight, or gradually eroding away entirely as wind and whatever occasional moisture reaches this particular stretch of shoreline slowly wears down what evaporation had spent years patiently building. The particular fate of any given formation depends considerably on its own specific location and structure. Formations positioned within more sheltered stretches of shoreline, protected somewhat from direct wind and the harshest exposure to sun, tending to persist considerably longer than those standing more fully exposed across open, unsheltered ground. This variation means the particular collection of visible formations scattered across any given stretch of shoreline continues shifting gradually across successive years. Older structures eventually collapsing or eroding away, even as newer ones, somewhere nearby, continue their own slow, patient growth toward whatever eventual shape and scale they will themselves eventually reach. Beneath the water's own current surface, similar formations continue growing in a manner considerably less visible to anyone standing along the shore, mineral deposits accumulating gradually along whatever submerged rock or debris happens to rest within this sea's own considerably concentrated water. These underwater formations grow according to the same basic chemistry driving everything visible along the surface shoreline, dissolved mineral gradually precipitating out of solution wherever local conditions happen to favor crystal formation, building slowly across months and years into structures that remain entirely hidden from ordinary view until, occasionally, the sea's own continued retreat exposes them directly to open air for the first time. This exposure, when it happens, offers a particular kind of discovery. Formations that spent years or decades growing slowly beneath the water's surface, suddenly revealed as the retreating shoreline explored earlier in this documentary continues its steady advance, leaving behind structures shaped entirely underwater, now standing exposed within open desert air, their particular form and texture offering a kind of frozen record of exactly how mineral crystal grows when given the freedom of fully submerged, undisturbed conditions rather than the repeated wetting and drying cycles, shaping the more familiar formations found directly along the ordinary shoreline. These newly exposed underwater formations often carry a smoother, more rounded quality than their surface-formed counterparts, their crystal structure having grown gradually in every direction at once rather than shaped predominantly by the particular, repeated rhythm of rising and falling water. Standing beside one of these formations, only recently revealed by the sea's own continuing retreat, offers a strange sense of encountering something considerably out of place, an object clearly shaped entirely by water, standing now on dry, cracked ground that may not feel the touch of that same water again for a very long time, if ever. Further still, An entirely different kind of mineral deposit has transformed considerable stretches of this shoreline in a manner perhaps even more immediately visible to any casual observer. Where ordinary beaches elsewhere on the surface of this planet are typically composed of sand, fine particles of quartz or other eroded rock accumulated gradually across thousands of years of ordinary coastal weathering, certain stretches of shoreline surrounding this particular sea have instead developed something considerably more unusual: beaches heavily covered in crystalline salt. These salt beaches form through essentially the same basic process explored throughout this section of the documentary: water rising and receding repeatedly across the same stretch of ground, depositing dissolved mineral with each cycle until the accumulated crystal eventually builds into something thick and substantial enough to entirely cover whatever ordinary sand or sediment might otherwise define. This particular stretch of coastline, walking across one of these salt beaches, produces its own particular sensation underfoot, a crunching, slightly resistant texture quite distinct from the softer give of ordinary sand, each footstep leaving behind its own small, temporary impression within the crystalline surface before the next cycle of water eventually smooths it away again. Beneath the immediate surface layer of these beaches, older, more compacted salt often forms a considerably harder, denser foundation, built up gradually across a stretch of time reaching back well beyond whatever recent seasons produced the looser, more granular crystal visible along the immediate surface. Digging even a short distance beneath the surface of one of these beaches reveals this transition clearly: loose, individual crystals near the top, gradually giving way to a considerably denser, more solid layer beneath, compressed gradually by the accumulated weight of everything deposited above it across however many years that particular stretch of beach has existed in its current form. The particular geometry defining every individual crystal scattered across these beaches and comprising every larger formation explored throughout this section of the documentary traces back to the same fundamental chemical structure introduced at the very beginning of this entire journey. Atoms arranging themselves according to the same consistent pattern every single time, producing the same basic, faceted shape, whether forming as a single small crystal resting quietly at the water's edge, or accumulating layer upon layer into towering columns rising from the ground, or spreading grain by grain across an entire beach transformed gradually from ordinary sand into pure, gleaming salt. The same precise geometry appears again and again from a single crystal to formations built across entire stretches of shoreline, each one following the same quiet mathematical pattern. Our original crystal, the small, precise formation introduced at the very beginning of this documentary, resting quietly at the boundary between wet and dry ground, exists as one small, humble example of the same process responsible for every formation explored across this entire section: the towering columns, the underwater growths, the crystalline beaches stretching across considerable lengths of this ancient shoreline. It shares the exact same fundamental structure, the exact same basic chemistry, differing only in scale and in the particular circumstances of its own individual formation. One crystal among untold billions, each one a small, precise testament to the same patient, ongoing transformation shaping this entire remarkable basin. Resting here, at the edge of newly exposed ground, surrounded by formations both ancient and freshly formed, this single crystal completes, in its own quiet way, the story this documentary has followed from its very beginning: water arriving from distant highlands, gathering within a deep, enclosed basin, concentrating gradually across thousands of years of patient evaporation, supporting its own quiet, specialized ecosystem, retreating steadily under the accumulated pressure of modern human diversion, dissolving ancient buried salt into sudden, dramatic sinkholes, and finally, here at the water's own present edge, crystallizing once more into the same precise, geometric formations that have always marked the boundary between this sea and the dry desert surrounding it. The light continues shifting gently across this pale, mineral-crusted shoreline. The same slow, patient rhythm of evening settling over water and salt alike, columns and crusts and scattered crystal all catching the same fading warmth in their own particular way. The whole landscape rests here, quiet and still, exactly as it has rested through countless evenings before this one, and exactly as it will likely continue resting, in whatever changed form the future holds for it, through countless evenings yet to come. Good night. Sleep well.